from Tampa Bay's #1 news station. This is Good Day Tampa Bay.
All eyes are on the city of Sanford. Jury selection will begin in the George Zimmerman trial tomorrow. The former Neighborhood Watch volunteer is pleading not guilty to second-degree murder, claiming self-defense in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. As the clock ticks down ahead of this much-anticipated legal battle, we wanted to get a preview of what we can expect. So joining us this morning, Assistant State Attorney Felix Vega. Good morning.
Good morning, Ian, Kristen.
Wow, there's a lot to talk about with this one. Let's start with the basics. We know the state did not charge first-degree or premeditated murder. The burden does rest with the state. So what does the state need to do to prove second-degree murder here?
Second-degree murder is different from first-degree murder, obviously. And we take a look at some of the elements. It really hinges on two particular things. First is depraved mind, and what was George Zimmerman's state of mind at the time of the shooting, and also was his act something what's called imminently dangerous. Some of the considerations the jury will look at is whether or not it was out of ill will, hatred, spite, or, quote, evil intent, and also whether or not it demonstrated an indifference to human life. Some of the things that they're going to have to consider, obviously, are the actions of George Zimmerman versus Trayvon Martin, all that information that we've heard, all that's been floated through the media about this, the confrontation. There are no eyewitnesses to the case, so to speak, so now it comes down to the state. How far are they going to roll back the clock to say, well, George Zimmerman got out of this car when he was told not to? The defense is trying to exclude all that evidence, and so the defense is going to want to focus really on that confrontation between Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, and really focus on the quote-unquote attack that Zimmerman says happened by Trayvon Martin.
Now, as you said, there were no witnesses. They were the only two that were there. So there's a limited amount of evidence in the case. We do have the 911 calls. Even the clothing that both Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin were wearing that night are considered evidence. Why is the forensic evidence so crucial to this case?
The forensic evidence always tells a lot in a murder case, especially when you're talking about any sort of intent or how the actual shooting happened. We know from the FDLE reports that were analyzed when they analyzed Trayvon Martin's clothing, they had the two sweatshirts he was wearing, that infamous hoodie we've now seen, and also you can see there from I pulled an excerpt of the FDLE report. There was the Nike sweatshirt, and there was another sweatshirt that was underneath. The important thing to remember when you look at the evidence that they looked at, it was actually a contact shot. What that means is the gun was so close to his chest, it went through not only two sweatshirts, a t-shirt, and he also had stippling or gunpowder embedded in his skin. So that indicates that the gun was right up against his shirts, and also it was also at a 90-degree angle, which means it went straight through and into his heart. That's kind of difficult to reconcile with the evidence where Zimmerman saying that Trayvon Martin was on top of him, he was beating him. You know, you would expect him to be flailing around. You expect that the gunshot to go off at an angle, so to speak, and it didn't. It was a straight shot right through at a 90-degree angle. So you can expect prosecutors to focus on that. The defense is going to claim, forget about the forensics. Trayvon Martin attacked my client. Look at his injuries, and that's what they're going to focus on.
Now, there's also that infamous 911 call we've been talking about, made by one of the neighbors. You could hear screams after the gunshot that killed Trayvon Martin. Both sides have been in court for the past few days about this exact issue. There's been conflicting analysis from the experts. Can either side end up really using it?
It's going to be tough because the phone call itself is going to be admissible because it's a 911 call. It's what they're arguing about is the analysis, because when the phone call was originally sent off to the FBI back in March of last year, they said it was inconclusive. They couldn't even make a voice recognition analysis of some sort. The other key thing to remember, I'm going to read directly from the police report, that they brought in Trayvon Martin's dad the day after the shooting. They played that 911 call for him, and this is what the officer wrote in the report. I asked Mr. Martin, is the voice calling for help was that of his son? Mr. Martin, clearly emotionally impacted by the recording, quietly responded, no. And so that's key for the defense to argue that, regardless of the expert witnesses. Now, the experts have been battling it out because the state's saying now that you can clearly say it's Trayvon Martin. Zimmerman's people are saying either you can't tell whatsoever, or one of them said that it was George Zimmerman. So what the judge might end up doing is just letting the jury hear all of the evidence, all the experts testify. That's 3 days worth of testimony right there, because this hearing is dragged on just as long, and that's the same kind of process you'll see in the trial if she allows that to happen.
Wow. Okay, so jury selection, the hearing continues in the morning. Jury selection starts in the morning.
That's what we're expecting at this point.
All right, so this is just the beginning. We
yes,
know
it
you'll
is.
be back to fill us in and tell us more. Thank you.
We have more at the 8 o'clock hour, actually.
Oh, yes. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen.
Still ahead on Good Day. Are you...
Fox 13's Good Day. Local for you all morning long.
We are now just 24 hours away from what could certainly be the biggest trial of the year. George Zimmerman is charged with second-degree murder in the shooting death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in February of last year. Now, more than a year later, the case will finally be settled. Assistant State Attorney Felix Vega has been following this one since the beginning, and he's back this hour to talk more about this. Hey, Felix.
Good morning again, Kristen.
Well, last hour we talked about really the basics of the case. So now let's address some of the big issues. First up, stand your ground. A lot of people were surprised when Zimmerman did not use that defense. Tell us what happened there.
And it's really not the defense of stand your ground. That's where the confusion's coming in. I saw this reported last week, which is why I wanted to really address it. Stand your ground is actually included in the self-defense instructions that are given to the jury. What George Zimmerman waived was that stand your ground hearing that he was supposed to have last month, which he would have been required to testify in. If the judge granted the stand your ground motion, then the case would have been dismissed, and he also would have been immune from any civil liability from the parents. However, and we can take a look at the stand your ground, the language that's in the stand your ground definition, specifically where you have no duty to retreat. That's the key here. And this legislature added that in a few years ago. And also they expanded it to where you have the right to stand your ground and meet force with force, even if you reasonably believe it was necessary to do so. And that goes to any place where you lawfully are. So then the other considerations they're going to have, they're going to get the definitions of in self-defense. You have reputation for violence, and was that known to the defendant? That's talking about Trayvon Martin. That's why the judge excluded all of that evidence for now about his school records, his use of marijuana, those photographs that were on Facebook. And you're also going to talk about physical abilities of both Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. That comes down to weight, height, age, all those factors.
Speaking of physical abilities, we probably should talk about Zimmerman's appearance. It's really no secret he's put on a significant amount of weight over the past year. Could that play into the case?
Well, they had to be very careful with that, because we remember when he got out of we saw that surveillance video originally where he got out of the vehicle, he's walking through the Sally Port. He was admittedly very, very more fit. And you see that video of him when he was giving the reenactment to the police. He was not the bigger guy that we see in court today. That's another great shot of him right after his arrest last year. Now Mark O'Mara said he's put on about 125 pounds.
What?
But it's 125 pounds, stress eating, I guess. But it's that George Zimmerman that you saw there in those first few frames of that video. That's the Zimmerman that the jury's going to have to consider, not him who's sitting in the courtroom. So O'Mara and his team have to be very careful about who they're portraying to be the George Zimmerman that encountered Trayvon Martin that night.
Now, that's interesting. Now, here's the biggest question. Do you think Zimmerman will actually take the stand?
That's the biggest problem for him, because he's given so many different versions of a story. We know of 3. He gave the initial account to the police. He went out and did that reenactment that you saw there in that last piece of video. He also gave that infamous Fox News interview to Sean Hannity last year, where he changed subtle things about his story. Who was positioned where did he hit his head on the sidewalk? He said about whether or not Trayvon Martin was going for his gun, whether or not there was how the struggle was going on. When you listen to all 3 interviews and you go back through them line by line, you pick out certain things where he changes one thing, where he shades something a different way, and the prosecution can use that if they want. Typically in Florida, we don't use a defendant's statement, or the prosecutors don't use a defendant's statement, but it can be effective if they're inconsistent and they can show a truer picture of George Zimmerman and what story was he really going with. So then he's got to change his mind and figure out what he's going to go with in his defense as well. There's also emails that he had that if he says, I was just going out there, I was the friendly neighborhood watch guy. Well, there's all these emails that he sent to people within Twin Lakes, the subdivision, regarding other activities of other African-American teenagers that he was kind of profiling. The defense doesn't want those words used, like profiling, that he was stalking him, anything of that nature. The judge still has to make those determinations. These are going to be fast-moving, basically very amorphous things that are going to happen during the trial.
Oh, wow. Now, this I really want to ask you about. The jury is not going to be sequestered for now?
As far as we know, they're not. And what Mark O'Mara wanted to to do with this panel of 500 jurors, he actually made a request to sequester all of them, which would be physically impossible, economically impossible. Whether or not the jury is going to be sequestered, because all of them are going to be coming from Seminole County as far as we know, and then what they will do is we got to worry about the media coverage. Our smartphones basically are our personal newsrooms. They're not going to be able to look at any of their smartphones. We also don't know how much coverage they've had and how much coverage they've seen. A lot of the Orlando stations, they've posted all of this information on their websites and really made a virtual court file. But as we know from any trial, they've got to be bound by what they see and hear in the courtroom. We may never know what happened to Trayvon Martin that night for real, but they're going to have to make that determination in the end of this trial.
I can't imagine how a jury not being sequestered would stay away from all of the information.
It's hard to do. And we saw that with Casey Anthony, where they took away their cell phones. And that was 2 years ago. Think about all the advances been made since then. So it's a very difficult situation, and they're going to have to consider that as well. We expect the trial to last probably about a month is what they're telling us right now, but that remains to be seen based on how fast they can get through jury selection and how fast Judge Nelson's going to keep them on a tight leash probably.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Felix. We know
My pleasure.
You'll be back
as
again.
Always.
All right.